Hi, my name is Rani Delev Tamari. I'm a lead Agile coach with Agile Sparks and a Safe SPC since 2013. User story mapping is an essential tool in Agile product delivery. So I'm excited to be here today to share with you some practical tips and tricks for how to use user story mapping effectively. I'll start with way back when I was first getting to know Agile around 2006. And I learned about backlogs and user stories and the small bits of value that we could deliver using these small stories. And I was really excited and I thought these were great and were very beneficial. But then over time, I started noticing that a lot of the products were coming out kind of Frankensteinish, like half baked, a bit disjointed, not completely the beauty that we had all been hoping and planning to bring. And sometimes even just the order in which we did things wasn't the one that really provided the biggest value that we possibly could. And then as I additionally started to have more and more experience with organizations doing agile transformation journeys, I noticed that a lot of times the people in the room were talking about the same product or feature, but they were really seeing things in very different ways. And, they didn't really have a common aligned vision of what it was that they were building or how they would go about creating that value over time. And so we really have that challenge of, on the one hand, wanting and understanding the need for breaking big things down into smaller pieces. But on the other hand, having all these user stories and still needing to maintain this big picture view. And this is where user story mapping enters. So in this session, I hope you'll become familiar with user story mapping and its benefits, learn some tips and tricks to facilitating user story mapping, both in person and remotely. And then I'll share with you a few tools that I've used successfully in online user story mapping. So let's get started. First, user story mapping. How do we go about creating it? So the first step is really to figure out who are the people that you need to have involved. And you're going to want to have representatives from the different types of users, different stakeholders, and of course the builders of the system. So these are going to be the developers, the testers, anybody who's involved in building it. And together you'll want to identify those personas that are relevant for your context. There's a lot of great information out there from the design thinking world about how to identify personas and do empathy mapping and customer journey mapping, etc. So definitely go out and explore that if you're not as familiar with it. But once you have at least identified the different personas who are going to be using your system, you're going to want to do the following for each of them. First, you'll want to identify those high-level activities that this persona is doing. Okay, so for example, what's the main big thing that they're going to do, and then the next, and then the next. And for each of those, you'll walk through and identify the details of those tasks from the persona's perspective. And then we will go through and update and see if there's anything missing. Are there any alternatives to the way that they're going to be using the system or wanting to use the system? And we'll go through and look at a bit more detail in a moment. And then lastly, but very importantly, you'll need to decide on the prioritization of the story map. So what will be the first things that you'll be working on, and the next and the next. Okay, so again, going back to how this would look visually. So we've got the persona, and we're going to want to understand what does this person do with the system. And these big yellow stickies up top are going to be the ones that are going to identify that. So for example, if we are creating a timer that will be put on top of presentations, and the presenter will be able to start the timer and have it time out after 5 minutes or whatever. So some main activities that the persona could do, if say we're talking about Debbie, who's a tech savvy and experienced presenter, well, maybe she'll want to do some configuration of that timer and then have it start and display, and then finally end the timer whenever the time has completed. So those would be the main things that would go on top. And then we will want to detail out the tasks, and that's going to be those blue stickies down below. And so these are going to be things like Debbie is going to configure how long the timer will be for, and then she can choose what it looks like. And then maybe she can click the mouse button to get it started, etc., etc. So as we move across horizontally, it's going to be this, and then this activity, and then this task, and that task. And we're going to look for different alternatives, different variations. So Debbie can either choose that the timer is going to look like an analog display or a digital display, and maybe the digital one is only going to be further down, and maybe even a sand clock is something that she would like to be able to do. And so it could be, as we're moving vertically down below, it will be this or this or this, okay? And as we move horizontally, it will be this, and then this, and then this, and then that. And then notice that underneath each of the big yellow stickies, we're going to have the bunch of stories or the small tasks that are going to all be under that category. So for example, in this example, it could be just setting up, configuring the timer. And then after we've mapped everything out and we've done this for all the personas, we're going to want to go ahead and do that prioritization and identify which things we're going to want to deliver earlier, and then what is lower priority that will be pushed down onto the next, next MMF or some future release down the road. And of course, we want to create during this the first initial space that we're going to have something like an MVP. We call it a walking skeleton, something that will give us a sense that this is the right direction for us. So you can really see how visually we get in a user story map two very different perspectives. We have the user perspective, and we also have the builder's perspective. What are we going to do first? What are we going to do later? And here's an example story map of the presentation timer that I'd mentioned before. And you can, go back to this and kind of get an idea of what are various options and what are going to be things we'll want to do earlier, like just being able to set the timer manually and then just using a mouse click to get it started. And then maybe the digital clock display is going to be the first option that we're going to enable. And when the timer stops, we'll have some pop-up indication. And down the road, we're going to allow more configurability, more options, and you can really see that we're going to learn and also make adjustments as we go. So when should you leverage user story mapping? From my experience, really almost any large feature or even an epic or product that you're building, it can really get a lot from creating this visualization with the user story mapping. And even if you're unsure how to break something down, there are a lot of great either user story splitting or feature splitting workflows and patterns out there. So definitely those are great to leverage. But sometimes you kind of feel stuck or you want to get the bigger sense of things, and what is going to be the sequencing for delivering it. And this is where this is going to be really useful. I've even had success using it in enablers, like in very technical type of features where it was surprisingly useful. So user story mapping, was really brought to the world by Jeff Patton, and he put out a great book with Peter Economy called the User Story Mapping Book. So that's definitely something to dig into. And I've included a few more references here online. Of course, you can get a lot more information. So at a really high level, what we can see is that it gives us, the user story mapping gives us a really common big picture. It creates that visual timeline from both of the perspectives of the users and the builders. And then it's actually really a collaborative process, because we're going to be creating it with inputs from all different parties. So I think you can kind of get a sense for why I got really excited when I started leveraging user story mapping. And it really brought, a sense of clarity and smoothness and understanding to, all those things that had previously been a bit disjointed with the flat backlog. So now I'll share some tips and tricks about how to facilitate user story mapping. we're going to start with the preparation. So, it's really critical since it is a very collaborative effort. It's critical to understand who and figure out who are going to be the right people to bring. And I mentioned, different types of roles that we'll want to have involved. And you also want to make sure that it's, not too few people because then you're missing out on the different perspectives because it is a very kind of brainstorming like process. And if you have too much of a crowd, that can also get a bit complicated. If you have a large set of people, you can break them into smaller teams that work on separate story maps and then pull them all together. Okay, it's definitely more of a facilitation, preparation and something that you'll want to pay attention to. But if you can, minimize it to a smaller set, then you'll probably have an easier time. And then you'll also want to clarify who are the content owners who are going to be the ones making those hard decisions about what's going to go first, what's going to be later. Okay? Because we will want everybody to be participating and bringing in their inputs and thoughts, but finally somebody's going to need to make that decision, those difficult decisions, and we want to know ahead of time who it's going to be. Is it the product manager? Is it something that is just within a team and the product owner can be the one to manage that? And then the other piece you need to think about is time. So how much time you set aside. For example, if you're going to have too short of a period of time, you're not going to be able to really complete it out. And what I've noticed is that when we have run out of time and end up having to schedule more, it's going to be taking some overhead to get back into the groove of things because it really takes some, your head sometimes to wrap around the complexity of some of these features. So definitely for like a smaller feature, at least an hour and a half, and then you'll want to increase that depending on the size and complexity of what you're working on. And then we're going to need to decide ahead of time, are you creating a physical story map with those stickies, or are you going to go with an online tool? Or you can also start physical and then convert it to an online tool later. But it will be important to decide that ahead of time. And I'll talk more about the online tools in the next section. So if we are doing the physical user story map, then a few things you need to keep in mind as far as supplies. You definitely want to have enough stickies. You're going to want to have markers that are just the right thickness, not too thin, where you can see in this photo, it's actually a little bit hard to read. And you want it to be not too thick when it gets too much to write it. And then from my experience, it's really helpful to use these static type of stickies that you are then able to move very easily. Why? Because, sometimes we realize that we totally missed a step and there's something else that we need to insert and everything needs to be moved to the right or some things need to be moved to the left. Definitely we're going to realize something is more important and then, other stories are going to need to go down. So it's much easier with these static stickies that you can really shift around rather than having to unstick all these regular stickies and then move them to the relevant place. And then you also want to make sure that the space that you're going to be doing this story mapping in has enough of an empty area near the wall where you're going to be working so that people can really physically reach it and interact. You don't want to be stuck in one of those rooms with a large conference table in the middle and people really are going to have a struggle getting to the board and it's kind of draining on the energy. And then the other thing you want to make sure is because the story map is going to be long-lived and you're going to want to refer to it, and we'll talk a bit more about that when we talk about what we do after the story mapping, then you're going to want to plan ahead and put all the story maps on these large flip chart papers that you can then transition to a different space if you're not doing the actual story mapping in the place where the story map will live later on. So a few tips for preparation regarding the virtual or online story mapping. You're going to need to choose a tool. I'll share with you those tools that I've had good experience with soon. And then whatever tool you're choosing, you need to make sure that people are going to have the right permissions to work in it, to really edit it. So do a dry run in advance. Make sure that people are not going to have to be dealing with logging in or setting up accounts or things like that at the beginning of the session. Make sure that's worked out in advance. And then you also really want to make sure that everybody is going to have cameras and have them turned on, since story mapping is something that you do also with people who maybe you're not interacting with as regularly sometimes, somebody who's a bit more external. And so you really want to make sure that they're going to be comfortable with turning on the cameras, and that will give us the great face-to-face interaction that we're always looking for in all meetings. But definitely here, we're gonna want to make sure that people are turned on. So a few things to keep in mind during the actual story mapping. So you want to start out with really clarifying what it is that we're going to do and how the story mapping is going to work. If you have people who have not been involved in story mapping before, you'll probably want to go through a few slides just kind of explaining what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, of course, so that they kind of understand what they're in for. And you really want to make sure that expectations are set. Again, those people who we identified previously, we're going to be the content owners and going to make that decision about priority. So we'll want to clarify that in the session as well, that we're all going to contribute, but here are the people ultimately who are going to decide priority-wise. And then you want to also clarify that the story mapping has an initial part of it that is going to be more creating options, creating those different ideas, and that's diverging. And some people can get a bit uncomfortable with that. It can feel a bit chaotic. It's a brainstorming process, and you want to kind of mention it to people, because that way, if they know that's coming, then they can feel a little bit more comfortable with that. Sometimes it's like, wow, we have so many options. Oh my God, how are we going to do this? It could be a bit overwhelming. It's a good thing, but it could be a bit tough for some. And then the latter part of the story mapping session is going to be the converging, okay, making those decisions, making those priority calls. So that's going to be a bit more, clearer and converging. And then we also really want to make sure that everybody's really engaged. So if you notice that somebody is kind of quiet, or somebody is not, really contributing their ideas, try to get them to be involved. Try to make sure that they're really contributing whatever it is that they have, and that we don't have somebody on the sidelines, not really part of the game. And then finally, but very, very importantly, we have to remember the goal, right? The goal ultimately is that we will have started from this hypothesis of what we think the benefits are going to be to building this. And we're going to end up creating that walking skeleton of those, initial things that we will deliver, that MVP. And, if you're probably all familiar with the visualization by Henrik for starting out with a skateboard, and then afterwards building that scooter and getting that feedback all the time. So you want to really be mindful of that ultimately that's what we want to do, and keep the first things very thin as far as what we're going to be building. So a few tips for after the story mapping. There may have been some people who weren't able to attend, or for whatever reason, we had a smaller subset of the folks. So you definitely will want to socialize. Whoever wasn't there, you want to walk them through, bring them to the story map, wherever it may be, walk them through it, make sure that they really understand. If they have any additional ideas, let's incorporate it, okay? It's great. It's not something that's set in stone. And we want to make sure that they're really aligned to the vision of how we're going to go about building things. And then you really want to make sure that you've captured that story map. So take some photos. You can, convert to an electronic version if it was a physical one. If it's an electronic, online story map, then you want to make sure you do some screenshots just in case, so you have that available. And then, as I mentioned before, since really the story map is supposed to be a long-lived, piece of work that we continue to update and really refer to, we'll want to make sure it's placed in somewhere that is convenient to access, again, whether physically or virtually. And then we'll really want to refer to it at very, specific events in our lifetime. So if we're at the beginning of the iteration planning, then we want to really make sure that we're taking a look at what's on the story map. What are the items that we had identified would be the next things. When we're doing the backlog refinement, that will give us a sense of which stories we need to prepare next. When we're doing the iteration review, then we're going to really want to make sure that we look at the story map and say, okay, here are the things that we have completed, and here are the things that this is where it brings us to as far as this MMF. Okay, and those are all things that take place at the team level. But of course, for the train, for the across multiple teams, you're going to want to be doing something similar as well, depending on the size and the context of the story map. So, just to summarize, keep in mind preparation, the tools, supplies, the workspace you want to prepare. During this session, make sure you have that, agenda, the facilitation mindset, and are really creating a sense of engagement. And finally, are coming to that walking skeleton of what's going to be the initial sketch, and then the coloring and the deepening of the abilities of the system. And then after the session, the socializing, capturing it, and really referring to it again and again as needed, and updating it as you learn and understand that things need to move around. Okay, so now we will talk about a few online tools, and I'm going to start from the basic to the more complex. And so we have Excel or Google Sheets, or something along those types of tools. They're very easy to use. We all know how they work. They're going to keep you really organized in those columns and rows, and you still have the ability to really expand and to shift things around easily. As you can see, colors are great. Here, for example, different colors indicate the needs of different personas, and you can really do a lot with these tools that we all have readily access to. And then we have more like the Google Draw or other drawing type applications, and these are going to be obviously more flexible as far as organizing the work, but then you're going to need to keep yourself a bit organized. You want to make sure that whatever you use is going to have a canvas that can grow with your story map, because they do tend to really grow over time. And then the more complex tools, collaborative wise, we've got Miro, which is a great option. They have a user story map template along with many other templates. And this is kind of what it looks like. And you'll get these placeholders that you can fill in. You can add additional ones, and they'll shift very easily. It's a convenient tool. You've got all the different things you could expect as far as labels, notes, navigation. It also has an integration into Jira and some other tools. So that's something also to keep in mind. What kind of integration are you going to want with your regular tool of choice? And we've got Mural. Mural is, a really more advanced form of collaboration tools, and it has a user story map template as well. So, a lot of people use Mural for online training, and but it can take a little bit more getting used to. So if the people who are going to be participating with are new to user story mapping and they're new to the tool, to Mural, maybe a simpler option would be better, but it's really up to you. And you can see that the story map template is actually quite extensive. You have a place to discuss your personas in more detail, so that's really great. You have a lot of options as far as the way that you can interact with it and the type of things that you can mark up. And it has, of course, the convenient navigation once your map starts to get busy. So I went over a few different options, and of course, there are many, many options out there. So you should go out, experiment and explore and see what is going to be the best for you. So as I was preparing this session and I was thinking about, a lot of the great things that user story mapping brings to the table, I went back to the safe, lean, agile principles, and I was trying to figure out, which principles do I think are the ones that are supported by user story mapping. And I was, actually interested to notice that there were quite a few. I'm curious what you think, if you'll agree with me, that there are quite a few that are supported by user story mapping. So, for example, applying systems thinking. So yeah, it really provides that big picture view, and you really, it keeps us from getting too much into the detail and forgetting what the bigger system is. So yeah, I like that one. It helps us assume variability and preserve options. We can choose what to do earlier or later and apply the principle in that way. And then, of course, because we're building incrementally and have that integrated learning cycles, we can adjust what is in the story map, and we can make sure that we're really focused on those learning cycles. And then because it's such a collaborative process, it really has the ability to unlock the intrinsic motivation of knowledge workers, because people really are engaged and they understand the bigger picture of why are we working on this particular thing. And then additionally, it really helps to create these decision-making and decentralizing it and making it more local, because the people who are involved, of course, the content authority is going to be able to decide how to move forward. So, I think that's quite exciting for a pretty, not such a complex technique that can really help us in moving forward in a lot of these different ways. So I'm sharing here a few quotes from people who have participated in story mapping sessions that I've been involved in. And, it really, I think, helps to show how having a really complex epic that people couldn't quite wrap their minds around it, the user story mapping really helped to clarify how to approach it. And then, an organization that's been really doing it for a while now, and they see that they really have the right people involved, and people are not surprised and are really aligned to what's the right way to approach things. So, I hope that I was able to help you appreciate and see how beneficial story mapping can be, and that you'll grow to love and appreciate it as well. And I'd love to hear from you. Any comments, any experiences you've had, any questions you may have. So please connect to me on LinkedIn or shoot me an email, and I'd love to be in touch. Bye.